At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 300 programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Ooh, a spicy question. I
because
love
the
it.
writing is sort of everything, right? Like you kind of can fix plot holes, but if the writing
So
isn't
some
there,
readers love that, and some readers are like, "But I wanted more of this." So it's kind of a gamble.
Hello and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by a writer whose debut novel was shortlisted for a host of literary awards. Calling in from across the pond over in Canada, it's Éric Chacour. Hello.
Hey, Jamie. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks so much for coming on. Let's jump right in, starting with the novel. Tell us a little bit about what I know about you.
Well, it shouldn't be a tricky question, but actually it is a bit because it's constructed. Well, it's built in a way which is quite difficult to sum up. But in a few words, I would say it's a story of impossible love, a family story also, and probably a story of exile. It's the story of one main character called Tarek, whose life was supposed to be very comfortable. You know, he would do the same job as his father, become a doctor, have the same place in the community as his parents, and make a good marriage. But I think comfortable lives don't necessarily make up for very good novels. So there will be something, there will be a spark, and all of a sudden his life will be changed.
Yes. What do you remember the first thought that inspired you to write this story?
I think it's always difficult, the question about the intentions, because especially for a first novel, I think you write it without thinking too much about your intentions. You just want to tell a story, which is in your head and which seems beautiful in your head, wondering if you would be able to write it beautifully. But I think there were two intentions. The first one comes from your country. I wanted to make my own Romeo and Juliet. Okay. And without spoiling too much the story, there is that incredibly witty mechanism of Shakespeare in his play that I wanted to reuse in my novel. So I think one of the intentions was this one. And the second one was to write a kind of long love letter to Egypt. Not necessarily the Egypt I know, because I've been maybe 15 times in Egypt, but the Egypt I'm talking about in that novel is quite different. It's the Egypt of one community, and it's at the time of my parents. It's a total fiction. It's not their story, but it takes place in their Egypt. So, I think these were the intentions I had. Okay.
So almost, I guess, as part of the research for this, but probably just you being the child of your parents, was a lot of this sort of brought on by the stories that your parents used to tell you about Egypt and like their time there?
Yeah, I was completely amazed by these stories, those of my parents, their friends, my uncles, aunts who lived in Egypt at that time, and in quite a specific community, which is a Levantine one, composed of Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian, who lived in Egypt, were mostly Francophones. Most of them spoke better French than Arabic, for example. Their mother tongue was quite often French. Mostly Christian and quite westernized in their way of seeing the world. And I was amazed by, the story of my mother, who told me that she went to the sporting club to listen to the new, the black disc of music coming from France, those of Françoise Hardy, France Gall, Claude François. And I was like, oh my God, at that time, they were listening to the exact same thing than in France, in Quebec, in most Francophone part of the world. And yeah, I was quite amazed by that. And I wanted to, I don't know, to reuse a bit that ambience in my book.
Okay. Yeah. About how even though it kind of feels like all of these cultures are like so far apart, but they're actually all kind of on the same wavelength.
Yes. And it said something about Egypt at that time, something that you could imagine that has never existed, because if you go to Egypt right now, you won't see that community, or very little compared to what it was. You won't see anything about this Francophone lifestyle, very westernized community. But I wanted to tell something about it. I don't know, maybe a testimonial, or I don't know, something like many memories that I wanted to talk about. But once again, it's only the background. It's not the story itself. The story is quite invented. But yeah, the background, I was very attached to that Egypt.
Yeah. And this was your debut novel. And I know that originally it was in French and had a different title. But how long, and am I right in thinking it came out in 2023 originally?
It went out in 2023 in Quebec in January, so more than 2 years now. And then in France a few months later. And yeah, it's been 2 years with that novel, and I'm quite amazed I'm still talking about it. It's quite a wonderful story, because it has been translated in 15 languages, and I don't know, it has a special life in each country. So I'm very happy when I have the opportunity to talk about it.
Oh, amazing. How long were you working on it before it was published?
Oh my God, Jamie, you don't want to know. Something like 15 years, I would say.
Wow.
But not, I mean, not intensively. There were years I wasn't even writing something, but years I was more intense on it. It was like a hobby, you know. I had my story, I had my plan. I knew exactly what I want to tell, chapter by chapter. Who were the characters in that chapter? What were the information they would exchange? What could, in my mind, give a pleasure for the reader to turn the page? And then when I had some little inspiration, I would go back to it and try to read, to write a chapter, not necessarily in the chronological order. So you may have in that book 2 chapters, one after the first, the second one after the first one, but both had been written with a gap of 15 years. I don't know. It's a debut novel, you know. It's something you write with a bit of innocence, without thinking too much what it could be. And when it is so warmly welcomed, well, it's quite incredible.
Yeah. Was it something that you just started doing? You just sort of on a whim, you just thought, I'm going to start writing and see where it goes?
Well, actually, my plan A was to be a lyricist.
Okay.
I really wanted to be a lyricist for Celine Dion, of course, because she comes from the same place as me, from Quebec. But yeah, I really wanted to write lyrics, but since I didn't know how to compose and I didn't know how to play an instrument, I didn't know any friend who would be a composer. I was like, okay, what's my next best thing to do? And it was probably to write a novel, because I didn't need to have any technique on anything. So it only relied on me. And I was like, okay, with a bit of sweat and the fact of wanting to do it, maybe I can write my novel. So it was a bit impressive, because I have never studied literature. But I had this story in my mind, and yeah, I wanted to share it.
Wow. I mean, yeah, it is the kind of one of the beauties of writing stories, writing prose and like novels, is that there is no barrier for entry. You can just do it, and there's not really a specific way that thing that you need to learn to be able to do it. Did you, whilst you were kind of writing and stuff, did you ever look into writing resources or like books about writing and things?
I was like, my God, there must be a recipe somewhere. So I was quite interested in learn how to build a story. And I found that study about how Agatha Christie wrote her books, which said that, well, researchers found that she was using shorter sentences at the end of her books, and also shorter words, like words of 1 or 2 syllables at the end, whereas in the beginning of her books it was longer words. So I was like, oh my God, first of all, if it works for Agatha, it will work for me, of course.
Yeah.
And if it works for sentences and words, maybe it could also for parts. So, my book is composed of 3 parts, and each one is shorter than the previous one. But actually, I haven't taken any class of creative writing or things like that. I was just trying to, I don't know, to write in my own way. Plus the fact I'm not the biggest of readers personally. So I'm very inspired by many other forms of art. We were talking about Romeo and Juliet, and theater is one of my biggest inspiration, but also songs. Maybe that comes from my lyricist career aborted.
Yeah.
And I don't know many other cinema, for example, movies. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm trying to get inspired by many forms of art.
Okay, that's interesting. Whilst you didn't necessarily look too much around writing, you didn't do writing courses, or you just sort of looked at a few writing craft things. Did you give your book to anyone to read? Like, did you try and get feedback from people?
Oh yeah, I did with 3 persons, and I think it's important to do it. To have some beta readers, I think they call it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to do it knowing exactly what you want from each person. For example, I made it read by my godfather, who lived in Egypt at that time, because I knew that if something was wrong in that story, he would see it and tell me about the background and the anthropological, societal context. I made it read by one of my cousins, because she's someone very who has a very good emotional intelligence. So I was pretty sure that you would see if the characters were well written, if we understood their inner struggles, And yeah, I think it's very important to choose people for what they can bring to your story, and to reassure yourself. And then when I felt it was ready, I sent it to one publisher, and I was lucky enough that the first one I sent it to wanted to publish it. So it was quite a quick process for me.
With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Oh, okay. So I know that this was in the works for a long time and started more like a hobby for you. Was there a moment in the process somewhere along the line where you suddenly thought, I think maybe this is more than just a hobby and I want to get this published?
Honestly, at the very end. During the pandemics, I was like, okay, it's been 15 years I was working on that. If I don't finish it right now, when we cannot leave our home for holidays, we don't have time to go to work in the morning and in the afternoon, I will never finish it. So I was like, okay, I have to end that story now. And when it was finished, I was like, it would be a pity not to try at least to send it to one publisher. Mm-hmm. And it's a funny story, actually, because I used to go to the Montreal Book Fair with my cousins each year. And that year they knew that I had something, like a manuscript on my computer. And it was like a game, we will look for the future publisher of Éric. So we were going in the stands and seeing the editorial line of each one. And all of a sudden we went on the stand of Alto, which is a Quebec publisher. And my cousin told me, oh, look at the covers, how beautiful they are. It's my favorite publisher. And I went in the evening at home. I look on the internet because once again, since I'm not the biggest of readers, I didn't know exactly who the publisher were. And I was like, oh, they are publishing very well-known Quebec writers, including some of them I have already read, like Dominique Fortier or Larry Tremblay. I should try to send something to them. So I just sent my manuscript on the generic email, and I was lucky enough to have an answer within maybe 1 or 2 months. And yeah,
that's pretty quick.
That's how the process. It was actually. I had no references about it, but everyone told me it was quite quick, so I was lucky, I guess.
I mean, yeah, that's pretty amazing. And also that you went. Did you look into literary agents at all, or did you just go straight for?
No, I didn't even know that that job existed. I was like, I sent it on the generic email as it is said on their website, and I think I was quite innocent doing that, because even them told me, but we don't necessarily read in priority all the manuscript we receive on that mailbox. You've been lucky. So I was like, yeah, I guess I was.
Wow. Because a lot of publishers nowadays won't even take submissions from just authors in general. It always has to go through an agent. So yeah, that's an amazing result for you.
I was very happy. But the funny story is that the person who will then become my publisher, at first she didn't believe it was an original book. Because she Googled my name and she found I was working in a bank. I was a director of strategy in a bank. She was like, this doesn't look like a debut novel. So maybe it's one of our writers who had some success back in time and who just want to reassure himself about his literary quality. So she made like an inquiry to find out which writer it was, and she didn't find anyone. So she was like, okay, maybe this story is happening in Egypt. Maybe it's an Arabic book written originally in Arabic, and they are trying to sell it as an original French version. So she asked a friend of her to translate some of the sentences, so she could try to Google them and find if it was an existing book, and it was not the case. But of course, I didn't know any of that.
Yeah.
And when we first met, she was asking quite disturbing questions like, do you write alone? And I was like, what does it mean exactly? And I was answering, well, sometimes I like to go in a cafe and write in a cafe, and I'm surrounded by people. And I saw that it wasn't what she was asking exactly, but I didn't know what to say. And one day the managing director of this publisher told me, "Oh, but Catherine, she didn't think at first that you were the writer of that novel." And I was like, "How come?" So that's how I knew the story, and we joke about it right now when I see her.
Wow, what an amazing compliment, though, that she was like, no, this is too good.
Well, I think
this is too good.
I tried to. Yeah, at first I was a bit, hurted that I was like an imposter or something like that. But I think it was, in a way, a compliment, I guess.
Yeah. Awesome. That's a great little story. We are at the point in the episode where I ship you off and maroon you and ask you, Eric, if you were stranded on a desert island with a single book, which book do you hope that it would be?
Well, I think it would be my favorite book, which is The Promise of Dawn by Romain Gary, who is a French writer. And it's really my favorite book. It's about, it's something we could call today an autofiction, even though the term didn't exist at that time. So it's very inspired by his own life. And I don't know, it's the kind of story very elegantly written with like a punch at the very end of the book that makes you reconsider the whole book. It's the kind of thing I just love to read. And maybe the character of his mother in that book inspired the mother of my main character, Tarek, in the way she was so fond of France and everything that was French, and she was very eccentric also. So I think that would be The Promise of Dawn.
Okay, that sounds great. I love how you talk about, you sort of wear your influences on your sleeve. Like you sort of have almost like connecting lines where you can point to like, oh, there was this influence over here and there was this influence over here, and that this has all kind of come together to coalesce in the novel that you created.
But it's not always that clear. I remember one day I had been asked to present my how could I say that, my dream bookshop with my favorite books, and I was talking about one book, which is La Sombra del Viento, the Shadow of the Wind, I guess, in English, by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. And while I was talking about it in that meeting, I was like, oh my God, but the character of the servant, I'm quite sure that in a way it inspired the character of Fatreya in my book, because there is a servant who is also very moving, but at the same time always saying funny things. And I realized that presenting the book in front of a public and an audience, so it was quite disturbing for me, but funny at the same time, that I was realizing that maybe the inspiration comes from that. It's not always so clear in your mind, but it's always funny to try to find out which were your inspirations.
Yeah, I've definitely spoken to authors where I've sort of extrapolated from something they've said and been like, oh, so this kind of explains why this was in the story, or so and so. And it's funny for them to sort of, I've had authors on who have thought, oh yes, I've never realized that before, but yes, that probably is where that comes from.
Whereas at the same time, you had some which are very clear to me. For example, the movie The Dead Poet Society. You know that movie?
Yeah,
right?
Robin Williams.
Exactly. There is one scene in that movie which is maybe the most moving one of the whole film. And I was like, why am I so moved by this scene in particular when I see it? And is it possible to recreate the same kind of emotion in my book? And it gave me what is probably my favorite scene in the book, which is, of course, quite different from the one in the movie, but trying to use the same mechanism to create the emotion. So, yeah, sometimes it's very clear in your mind where the inspiration comes from, and sometimes it's not at all, and you rediscover it by casuality.
Yeah, I think it's a really good thing to do to kind of develop your skills as a storyteller as well, to look at something that really elicited a strong emotional reaction in you and then break it down and think, why was I so connected to this? Why did it have such a profound effect?
I think it's the best way to create. Try to understand why at this very moment I was emotioned, I was moved, I was touched by something I saw or I heard. Music also is one of my inspiration. I know the musicality of the sentences is very important for me, and it was not so clear for me until I had discussions with my translators. For example, asking me about my intention behind that word. What did you want to say exactly with that word? Because in Spanish, for example, we could translate it in many ways. So what was the intention? And when I was trying to find out what the intention was, I was realizing that the 3 sentences in that part of the novel were exactly the same number of syllables, for example. And that's something very musical that comes from my aborted career of lyricist, I guess. But I know it was not, it was on purpose. Even though I'm not counting on my fingers when writing, I know it was something not incidental. I made it on purpose. So yeah, I think it's always important to try to find out where the emotion comes from and try to see if there is a possibility or not to recreate it in your own piece of art.
Yeah, that's a really great way of like putting it, and a great way to just develop yourself as a storyteller. I'd love to talk a bit more about translation. Coming up, I've got some more questions about that, a bit more about publishing bits and getting an agent. That's all going to be in the extended episode available on Patreon.
Oh my God, these who were only my imaginary friends, well, this kid is talking about them as if it was common friends we have now. And it's very moving when it happens.
Yeah, definitely. And we're at the end. So thank you so much, Éric, for coming on the podcast and chatting with me, telling me all about your kind of writing and publishing experience and the novel, What I Know About You, which is out as of last year. So it's out now. Everyone listening can go and get it. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Jamie. It was a very sweet moment.
And anyone listening, if you want to keep up with what Éric is doing, you can follow him on Instagram and Facebook at Éric Chacour. To support the podcast, like, follow and subscribe. Join the Patreon for ad-free extended episodes and check out my other podcast, The Chosen Ones and Other Tropes. Thanks again to Éric and thanks to everyone listening. We will catch you on the next episode.
O'Reilly. Check engine light on? Take the guesswork out of your check engine light with O'Reilly Veriscan. It's free and provides a report with solutions based on over 650 million vehicle scans verified by ASE certified master technicians. And if you need help, we can recommend a shop for you. Ask for O'Reilly Veriscan today. O'Reilly.